She sat outside his office for 4 years, made his coffee, filed his papers, looked away whenever he walked past. And in those 4 years, she was quietly running his entire criminal empire from a small desk in the hallway. Tonight, when Dominic Marcelli, the most powerful crime boss in New York, watched the woman step out of that black sedan in a crimson dress, he finally understood a truth that made his blood run cold. He had never been the smartest person in the room. She had simply allowed him to believe he was. If you're watching this until the end, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit like, and let's begin. The day everything changed started the same way every other day did, with Dominic Marcelli standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 42nd floor office, watching the city below like a man who had already decided he owned it. And he did, or close enough. New York had a way of sorting people into two categories, those who took and those who got taken from. Dominic had made his choice on that question when he was 19 years old, standing in a Brooklyn alley with bloody knuckles and his father's name as his only inheritance. 20 years later, the knuckles had healed, but the hunger never did. It just learned to wear better clothes. He was not a handsome man, not in any way that photographs could capture. He was built like someone had assembled him from parts meant to intimidate. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. His eyes were the color of old pewter, flat and patient, in a way that made people deeply uncomfortable when those eyes settled on them for too long. Women who met him at charity events described him as magnetic. The men who worked for him described him as something they couldn't say in polite company. He had a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and neither one was giving him what he needed. "Say that again," he said into the phone. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. Men who needed to raise their voices, Dominic believed, were men who had already lost. On the other end, his attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who charged $400 an hour and earned every cent, repeated himself carefully. "Carla isn't coming tonight. She says she needs space." Those were her words. Space. Dominic set the coffee down on the windowsill. Outside, 42 floors below, a yellow cab nearly clipped a cyclist, and the cyclist screamed something that the glass muffled into silence. "She needs space." That's what she said. "She's been living in my penthouse for 8 months and she needs space." "Dominic, I'm not angry, Gerald. I'm just clarifying the situation." He was lying. He was furious, not because of Carla specifically. Their relationship had the shelf life of cut flowers, and he'd known it for months, but because of the timing. Tonight was the Bellini dinner. Salvatore Bellini had been circling his territory for the better part of 2 years, probing for weakness the way an old wolf tests fences, pushing at the edges, applying pressure in places just subtle enough to be deniable. Tonight was supposed to be the night Dominic drew the line, came in strong, sat down across from Bellini with a woman on his arm and certainty in his posture, and made clear that the Marcelli organization was not a fence with weak posts. You did not walk into a traditional sit-down dinner alone. Not in their world. It signaled things. Vulnerability. Distraction. A man without a steady anchor. These were the kinds of signals that got interpreted, passed around, whispered about over other dinners and other private rooms until they calcified into reputation. "I need someone tonight," Dominic said. Female. Presentable. Somebody who can sit still and smile and not ask questions." Gerald hesitated. "I can make some calls." "Not that kind of call." He said it flatly. "Figure something else out." He hung up and turned away from the window and nearly walked directly into his own reflection in the glass panel beside the elevator, and then realized it wasn't a reflection. It was a woman. She was standing at her desk 10 feet away, pulling a manila folder from a filing cabinet with the careful, methodical movements of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She wore a gray cardigan over a white blouse. Her hair was pinned back tightly. The glasses she wore were too large for her face, which had the effect of making her look simultaneously studious and somehow absent, like a placeholder for a person rather than the person themselves. Dominic stared at her for a moment. "What's your name?" he said. She looked up. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly, more like the carefully controlled expression of someone who had learned not to show surprise. "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn Ashcroft. I've been your secretary for 4 years." "I know that." He didn't know that. He knew there was a secretary. He knew the coffee was always hot, and the files were always where he needed them, and the people who needed to be turned away were turned away without drama. He had not, until this moment, known her name. "Tonight," he said, "I need you to come with me to a dinner." She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "A business dinner, 8 o'clock. You'll sit next to me, you'll be polite, you won't embarrass me." He turned back toward his office. "Wear something appropriate." "Not that." He gestured vaguely at the cardigan without looking at it. "Something that doesn't look like you're filing taxes." He didn't wait for her answer. He had not yet learned that Evelyn Ashcroft did not need to be waited on. She had already made her decision before he finished the sentence. The car was scheduled for 7:45. At 7:43, Dominic stood in the lobby of Vance Tower in a charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, checking his watch with the focused irritation of a man who had built his entire sense of control around punctuality. His driver, a stone-faced man named Paolo, who had been with the family for 11 years, stood 3 feet to his left. 2 of his security detail flanked the entrance. At 7:44, the elevator doors opened. Dominic heard Paolo make a sound. Not quite a word. Something involuntary. The kind of noise a person makes when their body registers something before their brain catches up. He turned. The woman who walked out of that elevator was wearing a crimson evening gown that caught the light, like something that had been designed specifically to stop conversations. It wasn't revealing in any dramatic way. The cut was elegant, controlled, the kind of dress that announced sophistication rather than desperation. Her hair was down, dark, and smooth, falling past her shoulders in a way that seemed almost casual, except that nothing about the overall image was casual. The oversized glasses were gone. Without them, her face was sharper than he'd registered. High cheekbones, dark eyes that were currently reading the room with the calm efficiency of someone running calculations. She walked toward him at a pace that suggested she was not concerned with how long he had to stand there and process what he was looking at. "Mr. Marcelli," she said. He realized his jaw had tightened. He made it stop. "You look—" He paused. There was no version of this sentence that didn't give her something. "Fine," he said. "You look fine. Let's go." Paolo opened the door. As Evelyn passed him, the driver caught Dominic's eye for exactly half a second, and in that half second communicated something that in 11 years of working together, he had never communicated before. Dominic ignored it and got in the car. The drive to the restaurant took 22 minutes. For the first 12 of those minutes, Dominic reviewed his notes on the Bellini negotiation. The terms he wanted, the terms he'd accept, the lines he absolutely would not cross. He had done this so many times that the mental process was almost automatic. Build the wall. Know where every brick sits. Don't let anyone see the mortar. Evelyn sat across from him and looked out the window and said nothing. At minute 13, she said, "He's going to open with the Port Morris proposal." Dominic looked up from his phone. "What?" "Bellini. He's going to open by proposing a 50-50 split on the Port Morris distribution contracts. He'll frame it as an equal partnership." She said it the way someone might describe the weather. Informational, unbothered. He'll use the word respect at least 4 times in the first 10 minutes. It's how he establishes moral authority before he starts taking things. Dominic stared at her. "How do you know that?" His last 3 major negotiations followed the same pattern. Port Morris specifically because it's the access point that matters most to his distribution chain. Losing it would cost him roughly 18% of his northeastern revenue. He needs it more than he wants you to know he needs it. She glanced away from the window and looked directly at him. The eyes were steadier than he was comfortable with. He's also carrying significant debt through a shell company in Delaware, about $14 million. His quarterly obligations come due in approximately 6 weeks. The silence in the back of that limousine was a particular kind of silence, the kind that follows a statement that rearranges the furniture of a conversation. "You're my secretary," Dominic said. "I am." "You answer phones, you schedule meetings." "Among other things." "Where did you get that information?" Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. More like the look of someone who has been carrying a secret for so long, they've forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. "I've been paying attention," she said. "For 4 years, I've been paying attention." Before he could respond, Paolo's voice came through the partition. 3 minutes, Mr. Marcelli." Dominic put his phone away. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, really looked, maybe for the first time, and felt something that he was not accustomed to feeling. It was not attraction, though that was present too, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. It was something older and more unsettling. It was the specific unease of a man who has just realized that someone has been watching him far more carefully than he has been watching them. "At dinner," he said quietly. "You stay quiet unless I signal you." "Of course," she said. She said it with perfect composure. She did not, he noticed, say yes. The restaurant was called Ostra. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign outside, where the reservation list was shorter than the waiting list for the waiting list, where the lighting had been designed to make every person at every table look like they were sitting for a portrait. Private rooms branched off the main floor like chambers of a heart, each one soundproofed, each one staffed by servers who moved like ghosts and heard nothing. Salvatore Bellini was already seated when they arrived. He was 71 years old and looked like he had been built for the specific purpose of making younger men feel insufficient. He had the kind of white hair that read as distinguished rather than aged, a face that had collected its years into something severe and considered, and hands that were still large and steady in the way of a man who had done physical things with them and stopped only when he no longer needed to. He rose when they entered, a courtesy that was also a performance, and his eyes moved to Evelyn with the precise, unhurried assessment of a man who had spent decades reading rooms. "Dominic?" The handshake was firm. "I'm glad you came." "Salvatore." Dominic gestured. "This is Evelyn." Bellini took her hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. "A pleasure," he said. His accent was old New York layered over something older from somewhere else. His eyes, pale and sharp, stayed on her face. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Evelyn said. Her voice in this room was different, warmer, carefully modulated, carrying the specific frequency of someone who understands exactly how much space to occupy in a room full of powerful men. "Though I've heard a great deal about you, Mr. Bellini, your philanthropic work with the Westchester Children's Hospital was remarkable, the new cardiac wing especially." Bellini's expression shifted, barely, the way deep water shifts when something moves below the surface. "You follow that kind of work?" "I follow a great many things," she said, and smiled, and took her seat. Dominic sat down and said nothing, which was already a departure from his plan. The first course arrived, and Bellini did exactly what Evelyn had predicted. He opened with the Port Morris proposal, wrapped in language about partnership and mutual respect, deployed the word respect 5 times in 11 minutes, one more than she'd estimated, and laid out terms that would, if accepted, give him effective control over the northeastern distribution chain within 18 months. He was good at it. He made exploitation sound like generosity. He made the cage sound like a gift. Dominic had his response prepared. He'd been preparing it for 2 weeks. He did not get to deliver it. "Mr. Bellini," Evelyn said, during a pause so brief most people wouldn't have recognized it as an opening. Her tone was conversational, warm, almost regretful. "I wonder if we could speak frankly." Bellini looked at her, then at Dominic, then back at her. "Please," he said. "The Port Morris arrangement is interesting, but it assumes a stability in your current financial position that might be—" She paused, tilted her head slightly, as if searching for the right word. "Optimistic, given the restructuring you've been managing through your Delaware holding entity." The temperature in the room did not change. The lighting did not change. The server, refilling water glasses near the door, did not change his rhythm. But something in Salvatore Bellini's face went very, very still. 14 million in outstanding obligations, Evelyn continued, her voice carrying the pleasant neutrality of someone discussing stock options. Due within 40 days now, I believe. The counterparty in that arrangement is becoming impatient. I understand they've made inquiries through 2 intermediaries in the past 3 weeks. She picked up her wine glass. That's a difficult position to negotiate from, especially when you're asking for 50% of something you urgently need 100% of. The room was completely silent. Bellini's hands, those large, steady hands, were resting flat on the table. He looked at Evelyn for a long moment. Then he looked at Dominic. "Where did you find her?" he said. His voice was carefully neutral in the way of a man suppressing something larger. "She found me," Dominic said. It was the most honest thing he'd said all evening, and he'd only understood it was true as he said it. What followed was not the negotiation Dominic had prepared for. It was something else entirely. A renegotiation of the renegotiation, with Bellini slowly, almost imperceptibly, ceding ground he had come in intending to take. He didn't do it gracefully. Men like Bellini never lost gracefully. But he did it. By the time the dessert course was cleared, Dominic had secured terms that were, by any measure he could apply, extraordinary. Territory concessions, revenue splits that favored the Marcelli organization by a margin Dominic hadn't dared to put in his own wish list. A guaranteed non-aggression agreement with teeth. Evelyn ate her dinner and occasionally made quiet, precise observations about subjects ranging from international shipping to municipal tax law, and Bellini responded to each one with the focused attention of a man who has encountered something he cannot quite categorize and finds himself unwilling to look away. At the end of the evening, as they stood near the exit, Bellini pulled Dominic slightly aside, the kind of gesture that was polite in its performance and pointed in its intention. He spoke quietly, close enough that his voice didn't carry past the two of them. "That woman," he said. "Yes," Dominic said. "I don't know what she is to you. I don't need to." Bellini glanced toward where Evelyn was accepting her coat from the host with the composed grace of someone who had been doing exactly this their entire life. "But I will tell you this. If you are foolish enough to lose her," his pale eyes came back to Dominic's face, "someone else will not be." He straightened, smiled, extended his hand one more time. "A good evening, Dominic. Tell your people to call my people in the morning. We'll have the paperwork moving by end of week." He left. Inside the limousine, heading back north, Dominic sat with his jacket open and his tie loosened and looked at the woman sitting across from him with the expression of someone who has just discovered a room in a house they've lived in for years. "Who are you?" he said. Not aggressively, almost quietly. The way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer is going to complicate everything. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached into her small clutch, produced a single folded piece of paper, and set it on the seat between them. "I have 2 graduate degrees," she said, "economics and international finance. I graduated top of my class from both programs." She did not say which programs. He did not ask yet. "In the 4 years I've worked for you, I have rewritten 11 contracts that would have exposed your organization to federal liability. I redirected 3 law enforcement investigations away from your core operations by making sure certain financial trails ended at entities that had nothing to do with you. I have managed 2 succession crises inside allied families before they became crises you would have had to respond to. I have removed 4 threats to your organization that you were never aware existed." Dominic stared at this piece of paper. He did not pick it up. "You're a secretary," he said. The word sounded different than it had 12 hours ago. "I was invisible," she said. "There's a difference. Invisible people hear everything. They see everything. Nobody censors themselves around someone they don't think matters." She paused. "You held 17 meetings in your office in the last 6 months that I could hear clearly from my desk. Do you know how many of those meetings contained information that your rivals would pay significantly for?" "All of them," he said. He knew the answer the moment she asked. "All of them," she confirmed. He finally picked up the piece of paper and unfolded it. It was a list. Dates, names, amounts. He scanned it. His chest felt strange, tight. "These operations are yours," she said. "I acted in the organization's interest. I never claimed credit. I never redirected resources for personal gain. Every decision I made was designed to protect and strengthen what you were building." She paused. "Even when what you were building was about to collapse because of decisions you were making." The car moved through Midtown, through tunnels of light and shadow, past the city that had no idea any of this was happening and wouldn't care if it did. "Why?" he said. "You could have gone anywhere with those degrees, done anything." "I chose this," she said simply. "You chose to be someone's secretary. I chose to be invisible inside the most promising criminal organization in the northeastern United States, run by a man with extraordinary instincts and catastrophic blind spots." She said it without cruelty. It was diagnosis, not insult. "I spent 2 years studying every major organization operating in this city before I made my decision. I chose you because you were the only one worth choosing." Dominic put the paper down. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent and enormous. "What do you want?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I want a seat," she said. "Not a promotion, not a title. A seat beside you, equal weight, equal authority, equal responsibility." The limousine slowed at a light. In the silence, Dominic turned the question over in his mind the way you turn a stone over when you can't tell if something is living underneath it. He opened his mouth to respond. And then Paolo's voice cut through the partition, tight and controlled in the specific way that meant something was wrong. "Mr. Marcelli, I need you to look at something." He passed back a phone through the partition slot. On the screen was a message. No sender, no subject line. Just a photograph and 4 words beneath it. The photograph was of Evelyn, taken sometime in the last few hours. Outside Vance Tower, from the look of it. Before dinner. The 4 words read, "Who is she really?" Dominic looked at the screen, then at Evelyn. Something had changed in her face. The composure was still there, but underneath it, like bedrock shifting, something else was moving. Something old. Something afraid. "You know what this is," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the phone for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly. And for the first time since he'd known her, which he now understood was not the same as the first time she'd known him, the woman who had never shown him anything she didn't choose to show him looked like she was deciding how much of the truth she could afford to tell. The photograph was still on the screen when Evelyn reached across the space between them and took the phone from Dominic's hand. Not asking, not hesitating, just taking it, the way someone takes a thing they have a right to take, and looked at the image with an expression that was working very hard to stay neutral and not quite succeeding. Dominic watched her eyes move across the screen. He watched the small muscle along her jaw tighten. He had spent 20 years reading people in rooms where reading people was the difference between going home and not going home, and what he was reading right now was not guilt. It was something more complicated and, in some ways, more troubling than guilt. It was recognition. "Talk," he said. "Not here." She handed the phone back without looking at him. "Not in the car. Paolo's been with me 11 years. I know exactly how long Paolo has been with you." She said it without inflection. "That's not why I said not here." Paolo's eyes appeared briefly in the rearview mirror and then disappeared again with the professional discretion of a man who understood that certain conversations required him to be temporarily deaf. The city moved past the windows in smears of light. Dominic leaned forward. "Someone photographed you outside my building tonight and sent it to my driver's phone. Not mine, his, with a question about your identity. That is not a small thing. That is someone telling me they've been watching, and you recognized it immediately." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to understand that the answer I get in the next 30 seconds is going to determine a great many things about how tonight ends." She turned from the window. Her face in the moving dark was composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed a great many versions of this conversation and is now choosing between them in real time. "There's someone looking for me," she said. "Who?" "Someone I believed was dead." The limousine stopped at a light. A group of people crossed in front of the headlights, laughing at something, entirely unaware that they were walking through the edge of something that was quietly rearranging itself. The light changed. "Dead people don't send photographs," Dominic said. "No," she said quietly. "They don't." He took her to the secondary office. Not Vance Tower, not his apartment, but a 3-story brownstone in the West 50s that didn't appear on any organizational chart and whose address existed in approximately 4 people's memory, Paolo being one of them. It was the kind of place Dominic retreated to when the main infrastructure felt too exposed, which was a feeling he had learned over the years to trust even when he couldn't explain it. The feeling had saved his life at least twice. The ground floor was dark and smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. A single lamp in the corner, a heavy table, 2 chairs that didn't match. Marcus, his head of security, a wide, quiet man in his mid-40s with a broken nose that had healed crooked and eyes that were always doing the math on exit routes, was already there when they arrived, which meant Paolo had called ahead. Marcus looked at Evelyn with the careful, non-committal expression he used when he was actively forming an opinion he hadn't decided to share yet. "You need anything?" Marcus said to Dominic. "Close the front." Dominic pulled off his jacket and dropped it on the table. "Nobody in or out." Marcus moved toward the door and then stopped. The phone that received the message. Paulo's phone. Do you want me to? Already pulled the SIM, Paulo said from the doorway. He held up a small plastic card between two fingers. Dominic looked at his driver. You pulled your own SIM. Before we reached the tunnel. Paulo set the card on the table. Whoever sent it didn't expect that, so they may try another channel in the next few hours. Dominic stared at the SIM card for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. Get Reyes on the phone. I want to know who accessed the exterior feed on Vance Tower between 6 and 8 tonight. Anyone who shouldn't have a reason to be looking at that footage. Marcus left. Paulo closed the front door. The room contracted into something that felt smaller and more honest. Dominic turned to Evelyn. She was standing near the table, still in the crimson dress, which in this bare, functional room looked aggressively wrong, in a way that seemed to underline the distance between what tonight had been supposed to be and what it had become. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, more like she was holding herself still. Sit, he said. I'm fine standing. I'm not asking because I'm worried about your feet. He pulled out a chair. Sit down and start from the beginning. The real beginning. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. The calculation, the weighing. And then she sat. My sister's name is Isabella, she said. Isabella Ashcroft. She was 4 years older than me. She paused deliberately on the past tense, then corrected it. She is 4 years older than me. Dominic sat across from her and said nothing. When people were about to tell you something important, the worst thing you could do was fill the silence. 12 years ago, she was living in Rome. She'd married into an Italian family. The Caruso family, if that name means anything to you. It meant something. He kept his face still. Keep going. There was a train accident outside of Florence, the Eurostar to Milan. 19 people died. She was looking at her hands, which were flat on the table. Isabella was on the manifest. Her body was identified. She looked up. Or so we were told. But the identification was made by a representative of the Caruso family, not by Italian authorities independently, not by our family, by someone the Carusos sent. She paused. I was 22. I didn't know enough to question it. Our mother had just died 6 months earlier. She stopped, breathed. I accepted it, because the alternative was too large to hold. Dominic watched her hands. They were very still, too still, the kind of stillness that costs something to maintain. You're telling me your sister didn't die in that accident? I'm telling you someone arranged for us to believe she did. 12 years ago. She looked at him directly. And whoever sent that photograph tonight is using her identity to search for me, which means either someone is using Isabella's name as a tool, or Isabella is alive and is in a situation where she cannot reach me any other way. The lamp in the corner buzzed faintly. Outside, a car moved slowly down the block and continued on. Dominic leaned back in his chair. His tie was still loosened, his shirt open at the collar, and he was aware of a specific kind of tiredness settling into his shoulders, not physical, something older. The tiredness of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on was built on top of something he never agreed to stand on. The Carusos, he said. You know them. I know of them. Northern Italian operation. Old money, old connections, old grudges. He turned a ring on his right hand. A habit he had when thinking, one of the few tells he'd never managed to eliminate. They have relationships with 2 families in this city. One of them is not friendly to me. I know. She said it without emphasis. Of course she knew. If this connects to the Carusos, it connects to more than the Carusos. She stopped, looked at the table, started again. There are things I haven't told you about why I chose your organization specifically, about what I found when I started looking. Dominic's eyes sharpened. What things? I need you to understand that everything I've done inside your organization has been in good faith. Every decision, every intervention, my interests and the organization's interests have been aligned. Evelyn. His voice dropped into a register she hadn't heard before. It was not a threat exactly, but it was adjacent to one. Do not manage me right now. You've been doing that for 4 years, and tonight I'm telling you to stop. What haven't you told me? The silence that followed was not comfortable. It had teeth. When I started researching your organization, she said carefully, I had to go back further than most people go. I needed to understand the foundation, not just the current structure. Who built what? Who owed what to whom? The original partnerships. She pressed her lips together briefly. I found inconsistencies in the early records. Financial movements that didn't match the official history of how the Marcelli organization was capitalized. Every organization has irregular early financing. These weren't irregular. They were deliberate. She looked at him. Someone made very specific decisions in the early years about which families to partner with and which alliances to hide. Partnerships that, if they'd been known at the time, would have caused serious problems. She paused. One of those hidden partnerships involved the Caruso family. The room went very quiet. Dominic's expression did not change. This was the thing about him. The genuine thing, the dangerous thing. He could absorb information that would have cracked most men open, and his face simply held. But his right hand stopped turning the ring. My father built this organization, he said. Yes. You're telling me my father had a covert relationship with a northern Italian crime family. I'm telling you the financial records suggest a significant flow of funds between an entity connected to the Caruso organization and the early Marcelli operation during a specific 18-month window approximately 23 years ago. She kept her voice steady, clinical. I don't know what it means. I know what it looks like. What does it look like? She met his eyes. It looks like a debt, the kind you don't write down because you don't want anyone to know it exists. Marcus came back into the room at 11:47. His face had the particular quality it got when he was carrying information he didn't want to carry. He looked at Dominic. Dominic nodded once, which meant say it in front of her, which Marcus filed away and would later think about at some length. Reyes pulled the Vance Tower exterior feeds, Marcus said. Between 6:15 and 7:50 tonight, the camera covering the main entrance was accessed remotely 4 times. The access credentials used belong to a maintenance vendor who hasn't been active on our system for 7 months. Someone hijacked a dormant credential, Dominic said, which means they've had access to our security architecture for at least 7 months and have been waiting for a reason to use it. Marcus's jaw was tight. They didn't access anything else. Just that one camera, just that time window. He glanced at Evelyn. They were specifically waiting for her. Dominic stood up. He moved to the window, not because there was anything to see through the curtained glass, but because sitting still was no longer something his body would cooperate with. He stood with his back to the room and breathed slowly and thought about the shape of what he was looking at. 7 months. Someone had been inside his security infrastructure for 7 months. During those 7 months, Evelyn had been sitting at her desk outside his office, fielding his calls, managing his calendar, protecting his operation from threats he was unaware of. And someone had been watching, waiting. Not for him, for her. He turned around. Who else knows what you told me tonight? About the financial records? About the Caruso connection? No one. You're certain. I don't make claims I'm not certain of. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to need everything you found, all of it. Documents, records, whatever trail you followed to get where you got. He picked up his jacket from the table. And I need to know who in my current operation might have reason to want to know your identity and pass that information up a chain that leads to the Carusos. She nodded. But first, he said, we need to deal with the most immediate problem. Her phone buzzed. It was on the table between them, screen up. They both saw it at the same moment. Unknown number. No prefix. The kind of number that routing software couldn't trace back to a carrier because it wasn't running through one. She looked at it, then at him. Answer it, he said. She picked it up, put it to her ear, said nothing, waited. Dominic watched her face. What happened to it in the next 10 seconds was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen from her. The composure, that extraordinary, carefully built, relentlessly maintained composure, did not crack. It didn't crack the way glass cracks. It dropped, like something had cut the cables holding it up. What was underneath was not fear exactly. It was something more fundamental, something that lived deeper than fear. It was the face of a person hearing a voice they had spent 12 years learning to live without. Isabella, she said. The name came out barely above a whisper. Dominic straightened. Marcus moved from the doorway and stopped. The call lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. Evelyn said fewer than a dozen words during it, each one short, each one stripped of everything except the essential. She was listening. Her face moved through things that had no names, or rather had names that were too private to belong in a room with other people. Grief and shock, and something raw and furious and tender, all occupying the same space at the same time. When it ended, she put the phone down on the table very carefully, as if it were something that could break. Nobody spoke. She pressed both palms flat on the table surface, breathed in, breathed out. When she raised her head, her eyes were dry, but the skin around them was tight in a way that suggested what was happening behind them was being held at enormous cost. "She's alive," she said. "I gathered," Dominic said quietly. "She's been alive this entire time, 12 years. The words came out with a specific kind of flatness that was not calm, but was what was left after you poured out everything that wasn't numbness. The Caruso family staged the accident. She was forced into a life inside the family, hidden. She has 2 children she's never been able to take out of the country." Her hands pressed harder against the table. "Someone found her there and told her I was in danger. That's why she's reaching out. She's trying to warn me." "Warn you about what specifically?" Dominic said. Evelyn looked up at him. Her eyes in the lamplight were something he didn't have a word for. "She says the person looking for me is using her identity as cover. And she knows why." A pause. A breath. "She says the man who ordered the original attack on her, the one who gave the Carusos the reason to take her, she says it wasn't an enemy." "Then who?" She looked at him with an expression that was many things at once: apology and dread, and the steady, terrible certainty of someone who has just understood that delivering a piece of information is going to cause damage they cannot control or contain or walk back. "She says it was someone inside your family, Dominic," Evelyn said. "Someone who needed the evidence Isabella found to stay buried." Another breath. "She says it was your father." The lamp in the corner buzzed. The city outside moved through its ordinary night, indifferent and enormous. Marcus's hand, Dominic noticed from the corner of his vision, had moved to rest against the wall beside him, steadying something. Dominic stood very still. His father had died 9 years ago. There had been a funeral, a body, a grave in Queens that Dominic visited twice a year out of obligation rather than grief, because their relationship had been the kind that left marks rather than warmth. He had inherited the organization. He had spent 9 years believing he had built on top of what his father left. "My father is dead," he said. Isabella says the man who sent people to silence her. She saw his face, Dominic. Twice. Once the night before the accident, once 6 months later at a meeting with senior Caruso family members that she was not supposed to know about. Evelyn's voice was very even. She gave me a description. "Evelyn, it matches your father." The silence that came next was not like any silence before it. It had weight. It pressed down on the room, on the table, on the space between the two of them, on the foundations of 9 years of a story Dominic Marcelli had been telling himself about who he was and where he came from and what he had built and what he had been left. He turned and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Paolo appeared in the doorway, took one look at the tableau, and did not enter. When Dominic spoke, his voice was so controlled it sounded like something mechanical. "Get Reyes on the line, Sit," he said. "Tell him I need everything we have on my father's death. The funeral home, the coroner's office, the documentation, everything." He paused. "And tell him to cross-reference the name Caruso against every entity, every wire, every communication we've ever found in the old organizational records." Another pause. "Tonight." "Dominic," Marcus started. "Tonight," he said again. The room moved around this. Marcus pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. Paolo disappeared. The lamp buzzed. The city breathed. Evelyn sat at the table and watched the back of the man who had spent 20 years building an empire on top of a grave that it was becoming increasingly clear might not contain what he believed. The grave was in Queens. Dominic had been there twice a year for 9 years. February, because that was the month his father had supposedly died. A heart attack, clean and unremarkable. The kind of death that powerful men arrange for themselves when they wanted to disappear without drama. And October, because October was the month his father was born, and even between men who had done damage to each other, There were habits that outlasted the relationship. He had stood over that grave and felt nothing warm. He had stood over it and felt the specific hollow quality of grief that comes not from losing someone you loved, but from losing the possibility that you ever would. He had put flowers down once, in the first year, and then stopped because it felt dishonest. Now, at 2 in the morning in a brownstone in the West 50s, he was looking at a document on Reyes's screen that suggested the grave contained someone else entirely. Reyes was 29 years old and built like a question mark. Thin, slightly hunched, always leaning toward whatever screen was closest. He had the kind of intelligence that made people underestimate him until he opened his mouth, and even then sometimes after. He worked for the organization as a financial analyst, which was the polite name for what he actually did, which was find things that other people had tried very hard to make unfindable. He had driven to the brownstone in under 20 minutes and had been working for 40 with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the speed of his work had direct implications for his own safety. The death certificate, Reyes said, pulling up a scanned document on the left side of his screen, was filed through a funeral home in Bayshore, Meadowcrest Family Services. He paused. Meadowcrest Family Services was incorporated 11 months before your father's death. It operated for 14 months total. Then it dissolved. Another pause. The coroner who signed the certificate retired 6 weeks after signing it, left New York. We have no current location. Dominic stood behind Reyes and looked at the screen and said nothing. The body interred in Queens, Reyes continued carefully, was never independently identified by anyone with a biological connection to your family. The identification on record was provided by your father's attorney at the time. He clicked to another document. That attorney passed away 3 years ago. Natural causes, on record, but, Dominic said. He died in a private hospital in Connecticut. The admitting physician has no verifiable license history prior to 2008. The hospital itself has changed ownership 4 times since then, and the patient records from that period are, Reyes spread his hands, gone. Evelyn was standing near the back wall with her arms folded. She had changed out of the red dress at some point. Someone had found her a plain, dark jacket that was 2 sizes too large, and she wore it like armor, which in a practical sense was probably what it was. She was watching Reyes work with the expression of someone following a path they had already partially mapped. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. Paolo sat in the corner with a coffee that had gone cold. "Show him the wire records," Evelyn said. Reyes looked at Dominic. Dominic nodded. Another screen. A spreadsheet dense with transaction data, dates running down the left column, amounts in the middle, entity names on the right. "These are the financial movements I pulled from the original organizational archive," Reyes said, cross-referenced against the Caruso name as requested. He scrolled. There are 11 transactions over a period of roughly 4 years, running from 26 years ago to 22 years ago. They run through 4 shell entities, but the endpoint in 3 of those chains is a holding company registered in Lugano, Switzerland. He highlighted a cell. That holding company's registered agent is a man named Eduardo Caruso. A relative, Dominic said, a cousin of the current Caruso patriarch. He died in 2019. Reyes highlighted another column. But the holding company didn't die with him. It was transferred, quietly. The new beneficial owner on record. He stopped, looked at the screen. The pause was brief, but Dominic felt it. The new beneficial owner is listed under a corporate trustee name that traces back through 2 more layers to an individual using the name Vincent Moreau. The name landed in the room and nobody moved. "Vincent Moreau," Dominic said. "It's an alias," Evelyn said from the back wall. Her voice was steady. Steady in the way of something that has been prepared for a long time. "It's an alias your father used when he operated outside the U.S. We found references to it in 3 of the old ledgers. It was his name for transactions he didn't want attached to the Marcelli family." Dominic turned and looked at her. "How long have you known this?" he said. The question was quiet. The quieter Dominic's voice got, the people in the room had learned, the more it meant. "I found the alias 8 months ago," she said. "I found the Lugano connection 6 months ago." She held his gaze. "I didn't know what it meant in the context of my sister until tonight." But you knew my father had hidden financial relationships with the Caruso organization. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I was building the complete picture before I brought it to you. Incomplete information in a situation like this is more dangerous than no information. If I had come to you 6 months ago with half of this, don't. He said the word like a door closing. Don't explain the strategy right now. Just answer the question. You sat outside my office for 6 months knowing my father, who I believed was dead, potentially had active financial entanglements with a family that staged my sister-in-law's death, and you made a unilateral decision not to tell me. The room was very still. Yes, she said. Dominic turned away. He walked to the window again. He put one hand flat against the wall beside it and stood there and breathed. In the glass he could see a faint reflection of the room behind him. The shapes of people, the lamplight, Evelyn standing straight back near the wall with her too large jacket and her too steady eyes. Marcus broke the silence. What do you want to do? I want everyone out of this room except her, Dominic said. Nobody argued. Reyes closed his laptop with a soft click. Paolo stood. Marcus straightened from the doorframe. They filed out with the practiced quiet of men who had long ago learned to recognize the particular quality of Dominic's anger that required space. The door closed. Dominic stayed at the window for another 30 seconds. When he turned around, his face had resolved into something that was not anger anymore. Or not only anger, it was the expression of a man who has been forced to perform a fast and brutal surgery on his own understanding of his life. Sit down, he said. Dominic, please. The word cost him something. She heard it and sat. He pulled the other chair around so it faced her directly, 3 feet away, and sat in it and looked at her. Close enough that there was nowhere for either of them to put the conversation except directly between them. I need to know everything, he said. Not the version you were building toward. Not the complete picture when you were ready to present it. Everything you have right now in the order you found it. She looked at him for a moment, then she started talking. It took just under 2 hours. She talked and he listened and did not interrupt except twice. Once to ask a specific question about a date. Once to ask her to repeat a name. Reyes had left his laptop. She opened it and pulled up documents as she needed them. Financial records and corporate filings, and intercepted communications that she had accumulated across 4 years of careful, patient, invisible work. The picture that assembled itself was not clean. It never was, with things that had been deliberately obscured. It had gaps and ambiguities and stretches where the evidence pointed in a direction without arriving at a destination, but the shape of it was clear enough. Dominic's father, a man named Albert Marcelli, who had built the organization from a Brooklyn street operation into something with genuine institutional weight, had entered into a covert financial arrangement with the Caruso family approximately 25 years ago. The nature of the arrangement was not entirely clear, but the effect of it was, the Marcelli organization had received significant capital infusions during a period when it was overextended and vulnerable, and in exchange, something had been given to the Carusos that the records didn't name directly, but that subsequent behavior strongly implied was influence, access, the ability to move certain things through certain channels without friction. 12 years ago, Isabella Ashcroft, who had been living inside the extended Caruso family network through her marriage, had stumbled onto documentation connecting this arrangement to a political assassination that had occurred in northern Italy in the mid-90s. A judge, a man who had been about to testify in a proceeding that would have exposed financial connections between organized crime and government contracting. Isabella had not understood immediately what she had found, but she had made the mistake of asking questions, and someone had noticed her asking. Albert Marcelli, operating under the alias Vincent Moreau through his Swiss holding entity, had been informed. The decision that followed was the decision of a man who had spent 40 years protecting his position and had long since sorted human beings into categories of useful and dangerous. Isabella fell into the second category. The train accident was arranged within 3 weeks of the first indication that she was asking questions. She didn't die, Evelyn said. Her voice had changed as the hours passed. Flatter, more stripped down, the way a voice gets when it's been carrying something a long time and is finally putting it down. They kept her because she knew too much to disappear cleanly and because the Carusos found her useful. She was educated, she spoke 4 languages, she understood financial structures. They kept her as... She stopped. They kept her as property, dressed it up as marriage. Her first husband died 2 years after the accident. They gave her to another family member. She has children by both men. Dominic said nothing. She has been trying to find a way out for 12 years. She couldn't contact our family because they told her we had been warned, that if she reached out, we would be the ones who paid for it. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table again. She believed them. For 12 years she believed them because she had no reason not to. What changed? Dominic said. Someone inside the Caruso organization contacted her 3 days ago. Told her that there was movement, that someone was searching for the woman working inside Vance Tower, that the search was being run using her identity as cover, specifically to draw her out. She paused. This person told her that if the search succeeded, I would be removed, and that once I was gone, there would be nothing left to protect you from what your father put in motion. The clock on the wall read 4:17. Through the curtained window, the city had settled into its pre-dawn frequency, quieter, but never quiet. My father is alive, Dominic said. It was not a question. He was testing the sentence, feeling its weight. The evidence suggests, my father is alive, he said again. Not to her, to himself. Pressing it in, he stood up and walked to the table where Paolo had left a bottle of water and picked it up and set it down again without opening it. Then he turned. The person inside the Caruso organization who contacted Isabella, did she give you a name? No name. She said he identified himself only as someone who believed the arrangement had gone on long enough. Evelyn paused. She said he sounded old. Dominic's jaw tightened. He processed this. So we have a fracture inside the Caruso family, someone who wants this exposed. He turned the ring on his right hand. Which means this isn't contained. Other people know pieces of it. And if my father is alive and has been operating, the door opened. Marcus came in fast, which was something Marcus did not do. He moved like a large man who had learned to move like a smaller one, and fast was a gear he reserved for specific categories of situation. We have a problem, he said. Dominic looked at him. Reyes was running the secondary trace on the Vance Tower security breach, the dormant vendor credential. Marcus's voice was controlled in the specific way that meant the thing he was about to say was not controlled. It wasn't dormant. You just told me it looked dormant because it hadn't been used, but the access level attached to it... Marcus stopped. Started again. Whoever set up that credential gave it administrative access to the entire Vance Tower security architecture. Not just the exterior cameras, the interior feeds, the elevator logs, the access records for every floor. He looked at Dominic steadily. They've had a live view of everything that happens inside that building for 7 months. The implications of this assembled themselves in the room without anyone having to say them. 7 months of meetings, 7 months of conversations that happened inside Vance Tower that were never meant to leave it. 7 months of faces and names and decisions. Pull everything offline, Dominic said immediately. Vance Tower goes dark tonight. All digital communications from any device that was ever inside that building should be treated as compromised. Call the operations team. There's more, Marcus said. Dominic stopped. The credential was created by someone with existing administrative access to the system, meaning it wasn't an outside hack. Someone on the inside created the access point and handed it to whoever's been watching. Marcus paused. Reyes traced the creation event. It was done from a terminal on the 39th floor of Vance Tower. Another pause. 3 months before your father's supposed death. 9 years ago. The silence that followed this was the kind that makes the air feel different. 9 years ago, Dominic said. The access point has been sitting in your security system for 9 years, Marcus said. Whoever put it there did it before you took over the organization, which means it was there when I inherited it, Dominic said. It was part of what I inherited. He sat down, which was something he almost never did in the middle of a crisis, and both Marcus and Evelyn noticed it. He sat down and put both elbows on the table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and stayed like that for a moment. Just a moment. Then his hands came down and his face was clear again, or had the appearance of clear, which was the best available option. He built a surveillance capability into the organization before he disappeared, Dominic said. He's been watching. For 9 years, he's been watching everything I do, every meeting I have, every decision I make. He looked at nothing in particular. He didn't leave me an empire. He left me a stage. Evelyn was looking at him with something that was not pity. She didn't have that particular quality and would not have deployed it here if she had, but was something close to it. Something that acknowledged what he was carrying without pretending it wasn't heavy. There's one more thing, Marcus said. He didn't want to say it. His body language communicated clearly that he would prefer to be in any other room having any other conversation. When Reyes pulled the 9-year-old creation record for the credential, it had a user tag, the terminal ID. He cross-referenced it against the personnel records from that period. Tell me, Dominic said. The terminal was registered to your head of operations at the time. Marcus met his eyes. A man named Carl Dessner. Dominic went very still. Carl Dessner was not a name from 9 years ago. Carl Dessner was his current head of operations. Had been for 6 years. He had worked his way up from mid-level logistics management, had been promoted 3 times on the strength of his competence and his loyalty, and was sitting right now in an apartment in Midtown that Dominic paid for as part of his compensation package. Carl, Dominic said. Yes. Carl Dessner has been with me for 6 years. Yes. And he created a surveillance backdoor in my security system 9 years ago, before I took over, under my father's operation. The sentences came out flat and measured, each one a stone being placed. Which means Carl Dessner was my father's man before he was mine. Which means my father planted him inside my organization. A breath. Which means everything Carl has touched for 6 years should be considered compromised, Evelyn said quietly. She had been still through Marcus's entire report, processing it with the focused quiet of someone running calculations. Every operation Carl had visibility into, every personnel decision, every financial movement, every external relationship he was involved in facilitating. She paused. He managed the Bellini relationship for the last 18 months. Dominic looked at her. Tonight's dinner, she said. Bellini agreed to terms that were dramatically favorable to you, more favorable than he had any reason to agree to. Her voice was careful, picking through something. What if he agreed because he already knew what was coming? What if tonight wasn't a negotiation? What if it was a performance, designed to give you confidence, to make you feel like you'd won something significant, so that you'd be off balance and satisfied when the real move came? The room was very quiet. Bellini warned you not to lose me, she said. Specifically. He made a point of it. She was looking at him with those dark, steady eyes. What if that wasn't a compliment? What if it was a signal? What if he already knew what was going to happen tonight? The photograph, the phone call, Isabella, all of it. And he was performing surprise so that you would associate tonight's chaos with me rather than with him? Dominic stared at her. Then he stood up so fast the chair scraped back hard against the floor. He moved toward the door. Get Carl on the phone, he said to Marcus. Tell him I need him at Vance Tower at 6 a.m. Don't tell him why. Don't tell him anything else. And if he doesn't come, then we'll know something. He stopped at the door, turned back, looked at Evelyn. I need you to stay here. Don't use your phone. Don't contact your sister again until I say so. He paused. And I need you to understand that everything we just talked about, my father, Dessner, all of it, stays in this room until I decide otherwise. She held his eyes. I understand. Do you? He said it without aggression, genuinely asking. Because 4 years of information management ends tonight. You work with me now or you don't work with me at all. No more strategic timing. No more deciding what I'm ready to hear. Everything, when you know it, that's the only arrangement I'll accept. She looked at him for a long moment. Agreed, she said. He nodded once, turned toward the door again. Dominic. Her voice stopped him. He turned. If your father has been watching everything through that system for 9 years, he's been watching tonight too. He knows Isabella made contact. He knows we're here. He knows what we know. She paused. Which means whatever he's been protecting all this time, he knows we're coming for it. Dominic looked at her across the length of that bare, lamplit room. Behind him, the city was beginning its slow emergence from darkness, the first gray suggestion of morning pressing at the edges of the curtained window. Good, he said. He pushed through the door. And in the hallway, As Marcus fell into step beside him, and Paulo appeared from somewhere with his jacket and his phone, Dominic Marcelli walked toward the next hour of his life, carrying something he had never carried before. The knowledge that the man who made him might also be the man Carl Dessner arrived at Vance Tower at 6:03 a.m. Dominic watched him walk through the lobby on the security feed from Marcus's phone, a secondary system, clean, installed 18 months ago through a vendor that had no connection to anything Carl had ever touched. Carl moved the way he always moved, which was to say with the slight forward lean of a man perpetually behind schedule, his coat open despite the cold, a coffee cup in one hand and his phone in the other. 53 years old, gray at the temples, a face that had the particular quality of seeming trustworthy, which Dominic now understood was not an accident. He had spent his whole career confusing sincerity with skill. "He came," Marcus said. "He came because not coming would have told me something," Dominic said. "He doesn't know we have the terminal record. He thinks he's walking into a routine 6 a.m. call." He handed Marcus back the phone. "Let him get to the 38th floor. Let him sit for 10 minutes. And then I'll go up." Evelyn was beside him. She had been beside him since they left the brownstone at 5:15, and he had not told her to stay behind because he had tried that once already and understood instinctively that it would not produce the result he intended. She was wearing the oversized dark jacket and flat shoes that Paolo had sourced from somewhere, her hair pulled back, no trace of the crimson dress or the woman who had worn it. She looked like someone who had not slept and did not particularly care. "You should let Marcus handle the approach," she said quietly. "No. Carl has been operational for 6 years. He has relationships inside this building. If he feels cornered—" "I need to see his face," Dominic said. "When I say what I'm going to say, I need to see it." She looked at him for a moment and recognized that this was not negotiable and did not push it further. They rode the elevator in silence, Marcus on one side, Paulo on the other. The building was nearly empty at this hour. A skeleton crew of overnight staff, a cleaning team finishing on the lower floors, the specific hollow quality that large buildings get in the hours before they fill with the noise of people working. The elevator hummed. Dominic looked at the floor indicator and breathed steadily and thought about nothing except the next 20 minutes. Carl was in the main conference room on 38, sitting at the head of the table with his coffee and his phone, doing a convincing impression of a man waiting patiently. He looked up when Dominic came in. His expression was the same as it always was, alert, cooperative, carrying the slight professional warmth of someone who has learned to seem approachable. "Morning," Carl said. "You look like hell. Long night." Dominic pulled out a chair across from him and sat, not at the head of the table, directly across, eye level. "Thanks for coming in early." "Sure." Carl glanced at Marcus, who had positioned himself near the door with the stillness of a large object, then at Evelyn, who stood slightly behind Dominic's left shoulder. Something moved in Carl's expression when he saw her. Brief, almost imperceptible, quickly recovered. "What's going on?" Dominic put a single piece of paper on the table and pushed it across. Carl looked at it. It was a printout. The terminal access record Reyes had pulled. The date, 9 years ago. The credential creation event. The user tag. His name. Carl looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee and drank from it, which was the most telling thing he could have done, because it was a stall, and it was the first stall Dominic had ever seen from him in 6 years, and it confirmed in the space of that single gesture everything that the document already said. "I can explain this," Carl said. "I know you can," Dominic said. "You're very good at explaining things. That's why you're still here." He paused. "But before you explain it, I want you to understand something. I pulled every operation you've had visibility into for the last 6 years. I have Reyes running the cross-reference right now. By noon today, I will have a complete picture of everything that moved through your hands and where it went." He leaned forward slightly. "So the explanation you give me in the next 5 minutes is either going to be the truth, which might give us something to work with, or it's going to be a version of the truth, which will tell me everything I need to know about how this ends." Carl set down the coffee. He looked at the paper. He looked at Dominic. Something happened in his face. Not a collapse exactly, more like a controlled release, like pressure bleeding from a system that could no longer hold it. "Albert asked me to do it," he said. "Albert, not your father." "Albert." The way you say the name of someone you worked for, not someone else's family. When? Dominic said. 3 months before he staged the death. He told me it was a contingency, a way to keep visibility on the organization after he stepped back. Carl's voice was steady, which was impressive given what he was saying. He said you were going to take over, and he needed to make sure the transition didn't compromise anything he'd spent 40 years building. He needed to spy on his own son. He needed to protect the organization. That's how he framed it. Carl's jaw tightened slightly. I was 37 years old, and Albert Marcelli told me to do something. You didn't say no to Albert. You've been feeding him information for 9 years. Not feeding. He has the access. He looks when he needs to look. Carl stopped. I've had contact with him 6 times in 9 years. He doesn't need me to feed him anything. He watches the feeds himself. 6 times in 9 years. Dominic's voice was very quiet. What did he want those 6 times? Carl looked at the table. Twice he wanted confirmation on personnel decisions you'd made. Once he wanted financial projections on the Northeastern expansion. Once he wanted... He stopped again. His hands around the coffee cup were still, but his knuckles had gone pale. Once he wanted to know about her. He didn't look at Evelyn when he said it. He didn't have to. Dominic felt something happen in his chest. Not quite rage, something colder and more precise. When? 8 months ago. He'd seen something on the feeds. He noticed her behavior didn't match her position. The way she moved through the building, what she accessed, how she handled certain situations. Carl's voice had gone flat, recitative. He wanted to know who she was, where she came from. I told him I didn't know more than her HR file. Was that true? At the time. A pause. He told me to find out more. I ran a background check through a third-party service. What I found, he glanced at Evelyn for the first time briefly, was more than I expected. I reported back to him approximately 6 months ago. 6 months ago. Evelyn had told Dominic she found the Lugano connection 6 months ago. The timing assembled itself with horrible clarity. He's been hunting her, Dominic said. He's been monitoring her. There's a difference. There isn't. Dominic stood up. The motion was sudden enough that Carl flinched. A small motion, involuntary, the kind that happens before you can stop it. Dominic saw it and filed it. Where is he, Carl? The silence stretched. I don't know, Carl said. Carl, I genuinely do not know his current location. He contacts me. I don't contact him. That was the arrangement from the beginning. Carl looked up. His eyes were doing something complicated. Not remorse exactly, more like a man trying to calculate whether honesty or strategy serves him better, and arriving at honesty because all the exits are blocked. The last contact was 11 days ago. He told me something was moving, that I should stay close to the normal routine and not do anything that would attract attention. He knew Bellini was going to make a move. I think so. And tonight. Did he know about tonight? The photograph? The phone call? Carl's mouth tightened. He didn't tell me about it. But if he's been watching the feeds, he would have seen everything that happened at the building before dinner. He would have seen... Carl's eyes moved to Evelyn again, and this time stayed just for a second. He would have seen her leave with you. Dominic turned away from the table. He moved to the window. Outside, the city was fully awake now. The gray morning light hard and flat over the skyline, the streets below beginning to fill. He looked at it and thought about his father looking at these same feeds, watching him run his meetings, make his decisions, work 18-hour days building something he believed was his. A stage. Marcus, he said, here. Carl's going to make a phone call. He's going to use his normal contact method, whatever that is, and he's going to tell Albert that last night's operation has a problem, that the woman wasn't identified correctly and they have the wrong person. He turned from the window. He's going to say he needs an emergency meeting and he needs instructions. Carl stared at him. He'll know it's a trap. Probably. Dominic looked at him steadily. Make him believe it anyway. And if he doesn't respond, he will. Evelyn spoke from behind Dominic's shoulder. Both men looked at her. She was looking at Carl with the cool, dissecting focus of someone who has spent a long time understanding the architecture of other people's decisions. He's been watching this organization for 9 years from a safe distance. He's never had to act directly. He has an access point he believes is invisible, and a man on the inside, and he's been comfortable. She paused. Last night changed the equation. Isabella made contact. That was not in his plan. He doesn't know how much he told us or how much we verified. He's operating with incomplete information for the first time in 9 years, and that will make him reactive. She looked at Dominic. He'll respond to Carl's contact because he needs to reassert control. It's how he's built. It's how men like that are built. The idea of losing control of something he spent 40 years constructing will be more powerful than his caution. The room was quiet for a moment. Carl was looking at Evelyn with an expression Dominic couldn't quite read. You figured all of this out, Carl said. Not accusatory, almost wondering. Most of it, she said. Some of it was in the records. Some of it was in the pattern of decisions your organization made over 9 years, and the gaps where the decisions should have been different, but weren't. She paused. He's been steering you from a distance, Dominic. Small adjustments, keeping you strong enough to be useful and vulnerable enough to need him if the time ever came. Carl made the call at 7:14 a.m. He used a burner phone that he pulled from inside his coat, which told Dominic something about how long Carl had been carrying it and therefore how long he had been expecting some version of this moment. He dialed from memory. The call connected on the 4th ring. No greeting. A voice said, "This line is for emergencies." The voice was older, measured, with the specific rhythmic quality of someone who had spent decades using words as tools rather than communication. Dominic had not heard his father's voice in 9 years. He stood 3 feet from Carl and listened to it now and felt something move through him that he had no name for and did not try to name. Carl delivered the message cleanly, which Dominic gave him credit for. His voice held, he didn't rush. He laid out the false information with the practiced calm of someone who had been lying professionally for a long time, which he had. There was a pause on the other end, then, where did the identification fail? The background we ran was shallow. There's a second identity layered underneath the primary. She has a connection to an old case, one of yours based on what I'm seeing. Another pause, longer. How much does he know? Carl looked at Dominic. Dominic held up a single finger. 1. He knows something is wrong. He doesn't know the scope. Keep it that way. A breath. I'll handle the next step directly. Stay out of it. I need to know where... The line went dead. Carl lowered the phone. His hand was not quite steady. He cut off before I could get a location. We didn't need a location from the call, Evelyn said. She had crossed to Reyes's laptop, which had been open and running through the whole conversation. We needed him to use a response channel. She turned the screen. He called back from a number. It routed through 3 anonymizing layers. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. But the 3rd layer has a hardware signature, and that hardware signature has pinged 3 cell towers in the last 40 minutes. She looked up. He's not overseas. He's not in South America or Europe or wherever anyone assumed he might be. She paused. He's in New Jersey, Bergen County. He's been 40 minutes from this office the entire time. The silence that followed this was a particular kind of silence, the kind that comes when something you've been building toward suddenly arrives and is both exactly what you expected and somehow still a shock. Dominic picked up his jacket. Marcus, he said, assemble whoever you trust completely. I mean completely. Nobody who's had unsupervised contact with Carl's office in the last 6 months. 6 people maximum. We move in 2 hours. Dominic, Evelyn's voice was careful. If we move on his location without a containment plan for the Caruso side of this, we risk... I know. If the Carusos find out we've located him before we've neutralized their ability to act, I know. He turned to face her. His eyes were flat and clear in the specific way they got when a decision had been made and the part of him that debated decisions had gone quiet. I also know my father has been watching me run his organization for 9 years while sitting 40 minutes away in Bergen County, and I know he ordered the destruction of your sister's life to protect a secret that was never his to keep. He pulled on his jacket. The containment plan is you. You're going to spend the next 2 hours building me a wall around the Caruso financial network that makes it impossible for them to move money or resources in response to what we're about to do. You have Reyes, you have the full archive, you have whatever you need. He paused. Can you do that in 2 hours? She looked at him. I can do it in 90 minutes. Then you have 90 minutes. He turned toward the door, stopped, turned back once more, the way he had done in the brownstone hours ago. But this time what was on his face was different from what had been there then. The anger was still present, but it had been refined into something harder and more directional, the way raw ore becomes something usable only after it's been through enough heat. Carl stays here, he said to Marcus. Comfortable, not a prisoner, but he doesn't make any contact until I say so. Carl, who had been sitting at the table through all of this with the stillness of a man who has accepted the terms of his situation, nodded once. Dominic left the room. In the elevator going down, Paolo beside him, Marcus on the phone behind him already beginning to move pieces into position, Dominic stood and watched the floor numbers descend and breathed through the thing that was happening in his chest. The grief he was not going to let himself feel yet, the fury he was not going to let run loose yet, the specific ache of a man who has just understood that the foundation of his entire life was built by someone who never intended for him to know the truth. He thought about the grave in Queens, visited twice a year, flowers left once, in the first year, then stopped. He thought about standing at that grave and feeling nothing warm. He understood now that what he'd been feeling was accurate. He just hadn't known why. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. The building's morning crowd was beginning to accumulate. Staff arriving, phones out, coffees in hand, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary day. None of them knew what was happening above their heads or what was about to move through the city in the next 2 hours. Dominic walked through the lobby and through the front door and into the hard gray morning, and Paolo had the car already running at the curb. His phone buzzed. Evelyn. A text? 4 words. Wall is already started. He got in the car. Bergen County, he said to Paolo. Paolo pulled into traffic without a word, which was the right response, which was why Paolo had lasted 11 years. For 40 minutes, the car moved through the city, and then through the tunnel, and then through the flat industrial landscape of northern New Jersey, and Dominic sat in the back and looked out the window and prepared himself for the specific kind of confrontation that has no protocol and no script, the kind where the person across from you is someone you were supposed to be able to trust simply because of what they were to you. And you know going in that whatever comes out of the next hour will be something you carry for the rest of your life, whether you want to or not. Marcus called it the 50-minute mark. We have eyes on the location, single residential property, rural road, no visible security beyond standard residential, 2 vehicles in the drive. A pause. One of them is registered to a company that traces back to the Lugano holding entity. He's there, Dominic said. He's there. Position everyone at a perimeter, but nobody moves until I go in first, alone. Dominic, alone, Marcus. The line was quiet for a moment. Understood. Dominic put the phone in his pocket and looked out the window at the passing landscape. Bare trees, gray sky, the occasional house set back from the road, and thought about what it meant to confront the architect of everything you were. Whether you could do it without becoming something you didn't recognize. Whether the act of demanding truth from a man who had built his entire existence on concealment could be done without demolishing the person doing the demanding along with everything being demolished. He thought about Evelyn, about 4 years of invisible work and deliberate concealment, and the specific courage it took to choose to protect something that didn't know it needed protecting. About the difference between the kind of loyalty that performs itself and the kind that works in silence, without recognition or reward. He thought about Isabella Ashcroft, 12 years in a life she didn't choose, raising children in a family that had stolen her. He thought about the things people do to protect power and the things they destroy in the process. The car slowed. Paolo said, "Coming up on the address." Through the window, Dominic could see a private road veering off from the main route, lined with bare trees that met overhead like the ribs of something enormous. At the end of it, barely visible from the road, a house. Ordinary looking, 2 stories, pale siding, the kind of house that was designed to be passed without a second look. His father had always understood the value of things that didn't attract attention. He had simply applied that understanding to his own son. Paolo pulled the car to the edge of the private road and stopped. "You want me to stay here?" Dominic opened the door. The morning air was cold and sharp and smelled of wet earth and something burning somewhere distant. He stood outside the car for a moment and felt the cold work its way through his jacket and looked down the tree-lined road at the house at the end of it. Then he started walking. His footsteps on the gravel were the loudest thing in the world. The trees on either side stood bare and gray and perfectly still. Somewhere above him a bird moved through branches without landing. The house got larger as he approached, and he could see now that one of the downstairs windows had a light on, yellow and warm behind thin curtains. The universal signal of someone inside who believed they were the front door was unlocked. Dominic stood on the porch for a moment with his hand on the handle and felt the specific wrongness of that. A man who had spent 40 years in the business of survival, who had built his entire existence around controlling access and information and visibility, leaving his front door unlocked on the morning his past arrived to collect him. It was either arrogance or invitation. With Albert Marcelli, Dominic understood those two things had always been the same. He pushed the door open and went inside. The house smelled like old wood and coffee, and something medicinal underneath both, the kind of smell that accumulates when someone has been living somewhere alone for a long time. The entry hall was plain, bare floors, a coat rack with 2 jackets, a table with nothing on it. No photographs, no decoration. The house of a man who had eliminated sentiment as a security risk. The light was coming from a room at the end of the hall. Dominic walked toward it. Albert Marcelli was sitting in an armchair near a window, and the first thing Dominic registered was that his father was old. Not the old he had imagined during 9 years of a theoretical alive father, not some preserved version of the man he remembered. Genuinely old, the way time makes people old when they spend it alone without anything softening the process. He was thinner than Dominic remembered. His hair was entirely white. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, had the knuckled, prominent quality of hands that had shed the flesh around them. But his eyes were the same, pewter gray, flat, and patient. Dominic had inherited them. He had never understood until this moment what exactly he had inherited. There was a small table beside the chair. On it, a coffee cup, a phone, and a handgun that Albert had not reached for, which told Dominic something about how his father had decided to play this. "You walked in," Albert said. "I thought you might send someone." "I thought about it." Dominic stayed near the doorway. "I decided I wanted to do this myself." Albert looked at him with those inherited eyes and said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the gray morning light was flat and even across the bare yard. A bird landed on the fence post at the property's edge and left again immediately, as if it had made a mistake. "Sit down," Albert said. "I'm fine standing." Albert made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You always stood when you were angry, even as a boy. Sitting felt like surrender." He picked up the coffee cup with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be. "You found the terminal record." "We found everything," Dominic said. "The terminal record, the Lugano entity, the Caruso connection, the shell company, the coroner who retired, the funeral home that dissolved." He paused. "Carl." Albert drank his coffee, set it down. "Carl did what he was told. Don't punish him more than the situation requires." "I'll decide what the situation requires." "Yes." Albert looked at him. "You will." That was always the point. Dominic stepped further into the room. The floorboards were solid under his feet, which he noticed because he was noticing everything. The smell, the light, the distance between himself and the man in the chair, the weight of the gun on the side table that neither of them was looking at directly. "The point," he said, "building something that would outlast me. Building someone who could run it without me." Albert's voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man delivering a position he had rehearsed across many private hours. "You needed to believe it was yours, completely yours. Men who inherit things and know they inherited them never fully commit. They always leave a door open, an exit, a hedge against the possibility that they didn't truly earn it." He looked at Dominic steadily. "I needed you to earn it, so I removed myself and watched you earn it. Ba petitichi oshichuan. You spied on me for 9 years. I monitored an organization I built to ensure it survived the transition. You're going to use that word, monitored, in this room, in this conversation?" Dominic's voice stayed quiet, but something in the quality of it changed, the way the quality of air changes before a storm. "Carl reported to you. The Caruso family had access to your surveillance feed. Bellini was positioned to play a role last night that you choreographed. You have been running operations through my organization, using my infrastructure, without my knowledge, for 9 years. He paused. That's not monitoring, that's occupation. Something moved across Albert's face. Not guilt, not remorse, something harder to name. The expression of a man who has heard an accurate description of his behavior and is evaluating it the way you evaluate a map, for precision rather than feeling. The Caruso arrangement was from before, Albert said. It predated you. It was a debt that required ongoing management. Isabella Ashcroft, Dominic said. The name landed differently than the other things had. Albert's hands on the chair arms moved, barely, a small tightening, and then went still again. But Dominic had seen it. She found something she shouldn't have found, Albert said. She was 26 years old and she stumbled onto a paper trail and she asked questions because she didn't know enough to know not to. Dominic's jaw was tight. She had a family. She had a life. You took 12 years of it. I made a decision to protect the organization. You made a decision to protect yourself. The silence stretched between them like something physical, like a cable under tension. The judge, Dominic said, in Italy, the mid-90s. Tell me about it. Albert looked out the window. For the first time since Dominic had walked in, his gaze moved away, and in the movement was something that was the closest thing to shame that a man who had systematically removed shame from his operating system could produce. The Caruso family needed a problem handled. I had infrastructure they needed, and they had capital I needed. It was a transaction. A judge died. A judge who was going to create significant problems for a great many people died, Albert said. I didn't pull any trigger. I provided access to certain logistical resources. And when Isabella found the paper trail, I was informed. I made a decision. He said it without inflection. The same decision any man in my position would have made. You don't get to say that. Dominic took another step into the room. You don't get to make what you did into a category of thing that any man would do. You chose. You specifically chose. And a woman spent 12 years in a life she didn't choose because of it. And her children don't know what a normal life looks like. And her sister spent 4 years inside your organization trying to build enough evidence to understand what happened to her family. He stopped. You knew who Evelyn was. Carl told you 8 months ago. I knew she was a threat to the organization's stability. She was a threat to your secret. Dominic's voice was very quiet now, at its quietest. And you were going to do to her what you did to her sister. Albert did not answer this directly, which was its own answer. The photograph last night was a message, an identification request, not an action order. I was establishing her identity before making any decisions. You were going to disappear her. I was going to understand what I was dealing with. Don't. The single word cut the room clean. Don't do that. Don't turn it into language that makes it something other than what it is. I've been listening to men use language like that my whole life. You taught me to use it. I'm done with it. Dominic reached the side table. He picked up the handgun, checked it, emptied the magazine, set both pieces on the far end of the table, away from both of them. Not threatening, just removing the option. I'm not here to threaten you. I want you to understand that. I'm not here to do to you what you've done to others. Albert watched the gun pieces on the table. Then what are you here for? I'm here because you're my father, and because I needed to look at you when I asked you something. Albert waited. Did you ever intend to tell me the truth, any of it? The Caruso connection, the surveillance, any of it? Was there ever a version of this where you told me? The question sat in the room. Outside, the bare trees were still. The gray light hadn't changed. Albert Marcelli looked at his son for a long time with those flat, pewter eyes. And what Dominic saw in them, what he had not expected to see, what he was not prepared for, was something that was not coldness and was not calculation. It was something older and more corroded, something that had once been recognizable and had been buried under so many layers of decision and distance that it had become almost unidentifiable, but was still, at its core, the thing it had always been. No, Albert said. There was no version where I told you. The honesty of it was worse than a lie would have been. Because you needed me to believe I built it, Dominic said. Because I needed you to believe it, Albert said. And then, quietly, with the specific weight of a man saying the truest thing he knows how to say, and because you did build it, Whatever I gave you, whatever I protected from the shadows, the organization that exists right now, the relationships, the reputation, the direction it's moved in, that's yours. I watched you build it. I watched you make it into something better than I made it." He paused. That part was real. Dominic stood in the room with his father and breathed. The thing in his chest was not forgiveness, and was not absolution, and was not the resolution of anything. It was something much more ordinary and much more painful. The recognition that the person who made you can be simultaneously the person who damaged you most completely, and that these two facts don't cancel each other out. They coexist. They always coexist. And you carry both of them whether you choose to or not. "The Carusos," Dominic said. His voice had changed. The confrontation had burned through its fuel, and what was left was something steadier and more procedural. "Your arrangement with them, the financial obligations, the access, the influence, it ends. That's not something that ends with a conversation." "I know. That's why Evelyn has spent the last 2 hours building a wall around their financial network." He looked at his father. By now, every entity connected to the Lugano Holding Company has been frozen through reporting to 3 separate regulatory bodies across 2 countries. The documentation connecting the network to the judge's death has been transmitted to Italian authorities through a channel that cannot be traced back to us. He paused. "The Carusos are going to spend the next 18 months managing an institutional crisis. They won't have the capacity to act on anything else." Albert was looking at him differently now. The old assessment, the one that had been running since Dominic walked through the door, had shifted into something that was harder to read. "Isabella Ashcroft," Dominic continued, "she and her children are going to be extracted from the Caruso family's reach within the next 48 hours. I have people moving on that already. She'll be relocated, somewhere the Carusos won't look while they're managing their regulatory problems." He met his father's eyes. "You're going to assist with that." You're going to provide whatever information you have about the Caruso family's internal security arrangements that might complicate the extraction. You have 9 years of surveillance and a direct relationship with their senior people. Whatever you know that helps get Isabella's children out safely, you will give to me today." The room was quiet for a long moment. "And then," Albert said, "and then you're going to leave. Whatever arrangement you want to make for yourself, wherever you go, however you structure your life from this point forward, that's your business. But you're done with my organization. The surveillance access is already gone. Carl is finished as a conduit." Dominic looked at his father with those flat gray eyes that were his father's eyes, and weren't anymore, had become something else through the course of everything that had made him. "You will not watch. You will not intervene. You will not contact anyone inside the organization for any reason." "And the alternative," Albert said. "There's no alternative. This is what happens." Dominic picked up his jacket. "You spent 40 years teaching me that fear is the only currency that never loses value. You were wrong. You were wrong about that the whole time, and you built everything on top of that wrongness, and this is what it produced." He looked around the bare room, the empty walls, the single chair, the life stripped down to its minimum. "This." Albert looked at his son for a long moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and produced a small folded paper and set it on the side table. "The Caruso family's internal security for Isabella's wing of the estate is managed by 2 men. They rotate on a 36-hour schedule. The shift change is at 4 p.m. local Italian time." He pushed the paper toward the table's edge. "There's a service entrance on the east side that isn't on any architectural record. It was added 8 years ago. The code changes monthly, but the formula for generating it is written on the back." Dominic looked at the paper, then he picked it up and put it in his pocket. Neither of them said anything else. Dominic walked out of the room, down the hall, through the front door, back down the gravel path between the bare trees, his footsteps loud in the still morning air. Paolo had the car running. He got in, sat for a moment. "Back to the city," Paolo said. "Back to the city." The car pulled out and moved down the road, and Dominic did not look back at the house behind him, and Paolo did not suggest that he should. Isabella Ashcroft crossed the Swiss border with her 2 children at 11:40 p.m. on the second night after her phone call. The operation used the service entrance, the 36-hour schedule, and 3 people from Dominic's organization who moved through the Caruso estate in the dark and were gone before the shift change registered anything missing. She was 42 years old, and she walked off a private plane at a small airport in neutral airspace with a daughter of 9 and a son of 7 and a carry-on bag that contained everything she had been able to take, and Evelyn was standing on the tarmac. For a long time, neither of them moved. They stood 20 feet apart in the cold wind off the runway and looked at each other across 12 years and everything those years had contained. And then Evelyn closed the distance and Isabella made a sound that was not a word and would not have been comprehensible as one. And they held each other the way people hold each other when the holding has to carry things that language gave up on. The 2 children stood nearby and watched this with the calm, serious attention of children who have learned that adult emotions are large and require space. The 9-year-old girl reached out after a moment and took her brother's hand, which was more dignity than most adults could have managed. Dominic stood near the car at the edge of the tarmac and watched and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying better. The weeks that followed were not clean. Clean was for stories. The actual process of dismantling 9 years of compromise and contamination was slow and procedural, and often tedious. The kind of work that doesn't announce itself but shows up every day requiring attention. The Caruso regulatory crisis unfolded exactly as Evelyn had projected. 3 separate investigations across 2 jurisdictions. The Italian connection to the judge's death surfacing in a form that could not be suppressed. The family's senior members spending their energy and resources on institutional survival rather than external action. They did not come for Isabella. They did not come for the Marcelli organization. They had nothing left to come with. Bellini honored the terms from the dinner without revisiting them, which confirmed that his participation in Albert's scheme had been transactional rather than ideological. He had been positioned and used, and with the positioning apparatus dismantled, he defaulted to self-interest, which meant holding to an agreement that was already signed and would cost him more to break than to keep. He made no contact with Dominic directly. Dominic did not initiate any. Some things resolved themselves through mutual silence. Karl Dessner resigned from the organization in writing, citing personal reasons. Dominic accepted the resignation without annotation and ensured that Karl's departure was handled in a way that closed the matter rather than opening an investigation. Karl had done what he was told by a man he couldn't say no to. Dominic understood the architecture of that situation better than he wanted to. He filed it accordingly. The grave in Queens remained in Queens. Dominic did not visit it in February that year. He did not decide, formally, not to. He simply found that when February arrived, he did not go, and when he noticed this, he also noticed that he felt nothing particular about it, and he left it there. On a Thursday in late March, a second desk appeared in the executive office on the 42nd floor of Vance Tower. It had been brought up in pieces over 2 days and assembled by a facilities team that asked no questions, because facilities teams and organizations like this one learned quickly that the questions worth asking were narrow and specific, and the rest were better left unasked. It was a substantial desk, oak, clean-lined, positioned perpendicular to Dominic's so that the 2 of them could work independently or rotate to face each other without either arrangement requiring the other person's cooperation. On the desk was a nameplate. Evelyn had brought it herself, which Dominic had not expected, and set it in place with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone completing an administrative task. He was at his own desk when she did it. He watched her set the nameplate down and straighten it slightly, and then sit and open her laptop and begin working as if this were an entirely ordinary thing, which in some sense it now was. He watched her for a moment. "The Weiss contract," he said. "The restructuring terms we discussed last week. I've been revising them," she said without looking up. "There's a liability clause in Section 7 that needs to be rewritten. The current language creates exposure if the counterparty defaults within the first 18 months. I saw that. I've drafted an alternative. I'll send it to you this afternoon." "Fine." He turned back to his own screen, worked for a few minutes. "Evelyn?" "Yes. The nameplate. You didn't ask about the nameplate. Facilities just ordered it." She looked up then. Her eyes were steady and a little amused in the particular way they got when she was looking at him navigating something he found awkward. "I told facilities to order it. Was that a problem?" "No." He held her gaze for a moment. "It wasn't a problem." She looked back at her screen. He looked back at his. Outside the 42nd floor windows, New York was doing what New York did. Relentless, indifferent, enormous, running its 10,000 simultaneous stories with the magnificent unconcern of a city that has seen everything and contextualizes nothing. After a few minutes, Evelyn said, "Isabella called this morning." "How is she?" "Good." "Better than good?" A pause. "The children like the new school. Her daughter is apparently gifted at mathematics, which shouldn't surprise anyone." Another pause. "She asked about you." Dominic looked at his screen. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were difficult and precise and occasionally capable of surprising people." She said it without looking up. She said that sounded about right for someone who'd managed to keep her sister employed and alive for 4 years without noticing he was doing it. Dominic was quiet for a moment. "I noticed," he said. Evelyn looked up. "I noticed more than I let on," he said. "For the last 2 years at least, I noticed the work was better than it should have been. I noticed things were smoother than my decisions accounted for. I chose not to examine it too closely because the outcomes were good, and examining things too closely is its own kind of risk." He paused. "That's not the same as not knowing." She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that had seen more of his organization than he had for 4 years, and had chosen to use that sight in his service rather than against him. "No," she said. "It's not the same. I should have looked sooner." "Yes." "I should have looked at a great many things sooner." "Yes." She held his gaze. "But you're looking now." The honesty of it sat between them without requiring anything further from either of them. The city ran its story outside the glass. The 2 desks occupied the office with the solidity of things that had found their correct position after a long time of being somewhere else. Dominic turned back to his work. Evelyn turned back to hers. After a while, he said, without looking up, "Section 7. Send me the revised language before lunch." "You'll have it by 11, she said. And that was how it went. Not a clean ending, not a triumph, not the resolution of everything into something comfortable and resolved. Just the next hour of the next day, the ongoing work of building something worth building, the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of 2 people choosing to see each other clearly and act accordingly. The most dangerous person in the room, it turned out, was not the one who had spent 4 years in silence, nor the one who had spent 20 years performing certainty. It was the 2 of them together, the raw instinct and the patient intelligence, the force and the architecture, finally occupying the same space without either one pretending to be something other than what they were. It had taken 1 dinner, 1 phone call, 1 photograph, 1 dead man who turned out to be alive, 1 woman who turned out to be extraordinary, and 1 very long night in New York to get there. But they got there, and in the world they moved through, a world that rewarded neither kindness nor hesitation nor anything resembling mercy. That was the rarest possible outcome. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.